Hi, I'm Melissa Chan, and this is News Desk.
And I'm Girish Banerjee.
We are going to look at the Paris Olympics this week and are going to start off with comments from the French President Emmanuel Macron about the Paris Games. Have a listen.
So we wanted the Games to be profoundly useful to our country. Games that enable us to consolidate or accelerate profound transformations, such as the decarbonisation of our transport system, the renovation of entire neighbourhoods, the place of sport in our country, the inclusion of people with disabilities and gender equality.
That was French President Emmanuel Macron commenting about the Olympic Games and, of course, the usual promises that politicians make when they are talking about hosting the Games, how wonderful it will be and what an asset it will be for the city of Paris. But is that really going to be the case? At News Desk, we go in depth into one topic and, of course, with your comments and contributions, hopefully walk away after the end of an hour or so with a better understanding of the subject.
And I'll be looking at those contributions, those comments, those questions from you and bringing them into the conversation and putting those kind of questions to our guests, whom you will hear from shortly.
Yeah, so sports events are fun, but what about the ecosystem of the Games? The host city, how is it selected? Why was it selected? And what are its plans? How many years does it take to prepare for the Games? So we thought we'd ask this week, Olympics, why can't it just be fun? Can you divide sports and politics?
Yeah, why does controversy have to follow so closely behind? Is there another way around it? That's what we want to be discussing, that and certain other questions that you will hopefully be putting into the community chat. To help us answer all those questions, we're joined at the table by two News Desk veterans. Amian Esif, you all know as reporter extraordinaire, who will be giving us some clarity and context about the Paris Olympics. Dustin Hemmerlein will be in the chat, talking to you guys, answering your questions, guiding you through the topics that we'll be covering. One person you'll not be seeing is Wade Adams, because he's producing this conversation there with our technical crew. But speaking of conversations, certain comments have already been made in the community and in the community chat. And here is a sample of some of those comments, beginning with, I hope I get this right, at Sepi Lok Fui. As a normal human, I do not watch Olympics anymore, nor UN meetings, as we can see, that rules do not apply on the same standard to the citizens of the world. Then you also have a comment by at Mighty Atheismo, who is saying that the Olympics, with most things commerce and feckless pursuits of profits, have undermined the positive potential of sport by prioritizing the money over the human spectacle of athletics. And lastly, at Christian Aximera 9663 saying, commodified sports and politics, how magical.
Well, and in a few minutes, we'll also have Minky Warden of Human Rights Watch joining us from New York, and also Stanis Ellsberg from the Danish Institute for Sports Studies, which I didn't even realize was a department at universities, or at least at some universities.
Really? And send us your questions and comments for these experts. We'll put it to them once they finally join us. And while you consider what to ask, we can head over to Dustin, who has his own question for you.
Exactly. We have a question prepared for you guys. We wanted to ask you, would you want Olympic Games in your city? Over 50 people and the numbers rising have already voted. Let us know what you think. I think it's an interesting question. I definitely have a strong opinion, but I'm not going to say it to not influence you guys on what to vote. So far, yeah, the poll has a clear direction and clear opinion in one direction, but let's see how that changes.
Oh, that's very interesting and exciting.
What's that direction?
The direction is yes.
Just a straight out yes.
Yes, a straight yes. And the other thing I want to say, I thought it would be really cool if you guys want to share with us your memories you have connected to the Olympic Games. You know, these games, we all, they always come up over our lifetimes, and often, like, some of us might have memories connected to that. If you guys want to share that in the chat, I'll make sure the memories will be mentioned on the show.
If there's any gold medalists in our audience right now, just tell us what that was like standing on the podium.
Silver medalists, too. Let's not...
Also for the local Olympics that they had in their cities.
Exactly. Or if you're looking to in your city and you have a cool story about it, let us know.
Excellent. All right, so it is about the Paris Olympics, or at least partly so. We will be expanding the conversation to talk about the Olympic Games as an institution. But let's head over to Paris right now to our DW News correspondent, Sonia Falnikar. Thank you so much, Sonia, for joining us.
You're very welcome, Melissa. I'm glad to be here.
Can you just tell us how Paris is feeling like at the moment?
Well, I'd say the overwhelming feeling right now in the city is one of chaos. We're just coming out of a pretty politically turbulent time with President Macron having called snap parliamentary elections recently. There were huge fears of the far right almost coming to power in France. That did not happen. But we're now staring at parliamentary deadlock. Essentially, France does not have a government right now. The former prime minister and the cabinet are continuing in a caretaker capacity, handling day-to-day affairs, particularly with the Olympics. President Macron has said he will not be naming a new government until after the end of the Olympics in mid-August. And now with just days, literally less than 2 days to go before the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games on the Seine River, a huge chunk of central iconic Paris around the Seine River has literally been locked down for security reasons. Authorities have put in place an elaborate system of restricted zones, of QR codes, metal barriers for tourists, for residents, for cyclists, pedestrians, anyone wanting to access the Seine River and its islands. And this, as you can imagine, has caused a lot of confusion. There have been reports here in the local media about disappointed tourists not knowing really that they have to now get a digital pass with a QR code to access some of the monuments and museums in this high security zone around the Seine. That includes things like the Eiffel Tower, the Notre Dame Cathedral, the Louvre Museum. So there's really a lot of chaos and confusion, I think, at the moment in Paris.
Wow, so political chaos and also just pedestrian chaos, quite literally. Now, last year, as Paris was preparing for the Games, I was in the capital, and the Parisians seemed extremely skeptical of the Games. It sounds like some of their fears have been borne out. Has any of that changed at all? Do we have even some excitement from the Parisians themselves?
Well, I think there isn't a huge amount of excitement for these games. I was looking at a recent poll that was conducted 2 days ago. French people are indifferent about the Olympics. 35% have a negative view. Those are high numbers.
How many were indifferent?
And I think one reason for that in Paris here, of course, is simply that it has become quite a headache for locals to just get around their city in the run-up.
We lost you there. Could you tell us? Have we lost you again?
I have friends who stay on Ile Saint-Louis. This is an island of the Seine in 4th arrondissement. And they said that...
Get that next. Ooh, Sonia's breaking
town
up.
hall, apply for a digital pass, get a QR code, and have it scanned every day by security forces just in order to access their own apartment. And they've just told me that their district, their neighborhood now is absolutely eerily deserted. Shops are closed. Cafes half empty, everything is fenced in with kind of ugly metal barriers. The French authorities have said they will be compensated, some of these local businesses, for their losses, though only after the Games. So I think there is a lot of frustration here about the Olympics really upending the lives of locals for weeks to come, really.
But Sonia, these restrictions, aren't they only till Friday around the Seine River?
Well, that's true. I mean, a lot of the barriers that we're seeing, particularly around the Seine River, will be dismantled once those, once the opening ceremony is over. But you will still have other restrictions in place in the city. So maybe not these.
Oh, she's breaking up again.
Hiked up quite a bit in Paris. That is another thing that people here have been complaining about quite a bit.
Sonia, you've been breaking up a fair bit, but we want to get one last clarification from you. Nice catch from Amyan just now, but the percentages that you shared earlier in your answer just now, can you repeat that so we've got the numbers?
So there are a couple of polls floating around. The one that I looked at is carried out by a major radio station here. It says nearly 40% of people are indifferent to these Olympic Games, and nearly 35% say they have a negative view.
Okay, got it. We got that percentage, 40%. Sonia, you broke up there again, so I think maybe there's a lot of things that Paris Olympic Games need to work on, including perhaps the internet speed there. We're going to let you get going as a result, but thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's interesting, that bit about the internet speeds, because they need an Olympics to have restrictive internet speeds. We have no Olympics and we still have restrictive internet speeds.
It might not be, just to be clear, it might not be an issue with the Paris internet. It might be an
Let's
issue
just assume.
with the
Let's make a friendly assumption.
internet here in Berlin. Okay, so Baresh, or actually Dustin, do you have any chat reactions so far? Either of you guys, what are you guys seeing?
Chat is pretty quiet so far. Yeah, I don't really have anything to report.
Great. That's fine. That's fine. Guys, don't be shy. For those of you just tuning in, we're examining the question, Olympics, why can't it just be fun? Amin, I know that you've been looking into the Paris Games. What have you prepared for us?
Yeah, well, there's some good things and some bad things.
Okay.
So basically, I mean, the way that I've been thinking about it is if you have a major international event, maybe the major international sporting event, right? Then it's going to be this colossal project that is going to trample some people, and it's also going to be an amazing time for some people, you know? So there's always pros and cons. And so that's what I was looking at. Like, what are the major good things that came out of this? Paris is really trying to sell this to their own people. We saw that like something like 70% of people aren't really excited about the whole thing. And there's also a lot of people saying, like, actually, nobody really wants this in their city anymore because of the major costs. And are the days of global sporting events over, or numbered at least? So here's the selling points. This is what Paris has said. This is the shining beacon that we all promised you, I think, like 7 years ago when they
Were awarded,
they awarded the 2024 Olympics. So the big thing really that sold the Olympic Committee on Paris was the low costs, because they had seen all these kind of like disasters, financial disasters precede 2017, I think it was, when they made the decision. You had the Rio Olympics right before that, where the country basically said they were in a financial crisis right before the Olympics started. And some people said that was even because of the Olympics. They spent billions of dollars on stadiums that eventually never got used again. You can argue the economics of it. They pumped this money into the economy. So some people said that could help, but it was really like a financial disaster at the moment of the Olympics. And that really didn't look good for them. Paris comes along and says, we can do this really cheap. We already have all of these structures that we're going to use for the 2024 Olympics. So they promised they could do it for like under $10 billion.
Which sounds like a lot of money.
That's a lot for me, but not for a city like Paris, and definitely not for something like the Olympics. In comparison, you had Beijing Olympics in 2008 that some estimates placed at $53 billion. And so 10 billion is actually quite a reduction of costs when you're thinking they're putting on the exact same event. It's not like they're doing a small version of the Olympics. They have the same number of athletes, same number of events, same number of visitors probably. So that's a huge savings. And the way they did it is that they have all the existing stadiums and everything. So that really sold the Olympic Committee on them. Another big thing was the cleaning up of the river. And this is something that a lot of Parisians said was their favorite aspect of the Olympics. So basically they said, we have this dirty river, we pump sewage into it.
Really?
Yeah, well, what happens is when it rains, when there's a big storm, and Paris is not known for its 365 days of sun, so when it storms, the sewage system overflows, and the way they protect it from like collapsing is they just open up valves in the actual sewage system that goes directly into the Seine. So unfiltered sewage will be pumped into the Seine if there's a storm.
Wow.
What they did after 100 years of the Seine not being swimmable is say, okay, we're finally going to clean this thing up. We're going to build these multi-billion-dollar cisterns, these basically giant holding tanks for the sewage, so that when it floods, they're going to be pumped into these tanks and not directly into the Seine. And then the tanks will then be pumped to treatment plants. And this project has been going on for a really long time, and they say that they've completed it, basically. There's still some work to be done, but they've cleaned the Seine to a point where in the 70s, there was basically no fish swimming in the river anymore because it was so toxic and full of bacteria. And now there's 34 species of fish. And they think that after the Olympics, hopefully, people can swim in it like it's a beach. So that'll really change Paris.
It's really interesting. They had to wait a whole century for the Olympics to come along. I mean, it's not the first Olympics that Paris is hosting, right? Paris, I think, was it 1924 or 25, whenever they...
Yeah, I can't remember. I know the first one was in 1900.
Do we have images
in the river
do
in
we have
1900.
images of the Seine control
Yeah,
room?
actually, so the mayor did this publicity stunt.
Okay.
She actually swam in the river.
I mean, as we're looking at those images, there is a user, Steffel Lemmy, who's saying that the Paris Olympics has helped clean up Paris. So there is somebody who's at least benefited.
And this is a big coup for her, too. She's from the Socialist Party, which is a social democratic party. She's been calling herself the environmentalist mayor for a long time. She's the one that's brought bikes back to the city in a lot of ways. And so there she goes, jumping into what does not look like a clean river, but
Yeah.
that's a really clean brown.
Clean brown. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to jump into that, to be honest.
Well,
Yeah, but
Was she fine after she's okay, right?
she's still the mayor of Paris. She's still the mayor of Paris. and it's interesting you say clean brown, because I think it's free of fecal matter, right? Because I think in June they tested
exactly. Well, that was the thing. She was supposed to jump in at the beginning of June, and then she canceled it. And she said it was because of the snap elections that were called, the political chaos.
Yeah.
But then it came out like a week later that they tested and they found like high levels of E. coli, which is found in human poo. And so I think they had to do a few more things before they were like, okay, let's have our mayor jump into this very beautiful river. But she did it, and I was joking when I said nobody's heard from her since. She seems to be fine. And yeah, so that was a big coup for her. And it was something that's the background to this, which is what Macron said, is that we're using the Olympics as an excuse to make our city better, which is not actually a lie. I mean, a lot of cities, if they do it right, can actually use the Olympics as basically a deadline. So it started in 1991 when Mitterrand was president, this idea that they wanted to clean up the Seine. Jacques Chirac campaigned on cleaning up the Seine. And then in 2015, when they first started announcing that they were going to bid for the Paris Olympics, they said, we're going to clean up the Seine so that our athletes can swim in it. So since 2015, they've been working on this project. And this was basically the deadline for it.
And actually, now that I think about it, the plan is to have some of the competitions in the river, I believe, long distance.
I think triathlon is going to be there. Because triathlon is always, you swim in like natural water bodies, like lakes and rivers and stuff like that. So,
well, I mean, we're journalists, so what are the cons? Because we always look at the
dark
glass
side.
half empty.
I wanted to this is so funny because just today I was like, okay, I want to know what the latest news about the Olympics is. I Googled it. And if you can share my screen, this is what came up. It's pretty awful stuff. I mean, and here's where I'm all joking aside, this is not a laughing matter. There's been like major crimes, including rape and robbery that have happened around, because you have so many people coming into Paris.
Can you zoom in a little bit so we can see it better?
Yeah.
Yep.
Does that help at all?
Yeah.
An athlete has dropped out because she was caught beating her horse. France, here's one from the Financial Times to just sum it all up. France faces glut of unwanted Olympic tickets. So apparently they can't actually sell all the tickets.
Wow.
So those statistics that Sonia was giving us earlier, there must be some truth to them.
Right. If your city is not really interested in going, it might pick up after the games start. That's usually when people start to get excited about this.
Yeah.
But this is just like Googling it. And this is also the media being very negative, obviously, but it does seem like games like this, they just attract a lot of bad headlines. So the two big ones that I wanted to focus on were, let's see, what do we got here? The biggest problem was that they wanted to clean up the city. They want to clean up the Seine, the river, environmental, but some activists are saying that they're also trying to clean up society. So Paris has a lot of immigration. They've had a lot of asylum seekers come there that they haven't dealt with. They haven't processed their applications. And a lot of them have had to just sleep on the streets and in tent cities. And Paris has been cleaning up these tent cities for quite a while now. But it seems a lot of people in Paris who work with migrants are saying they've also set the Olympics as their deadline for getting rid of the unwanted people.
So clearing out homeless encampments.
Clearing out homeless camp, it's not just homeless, like Parisian homeless, but like especially asylum seekers who are there with their children, their whole families, and they're waiting for their applications to be processed and sleeping in tents. And what they've done is they've set up a system of busing to take them to processing centers outside of Paris in order to, what they say is unrelated to the Olympics, just to relieve the burden on the Parisian asylum system. But it does seem like quite a coincidence that these centers, SAS centers they're called, were set up in 2023, so a year before this massive games that they've been planning on for the past 7 years.
Right.
And so they have buses come and take people from these tent camps. I mean, you can say something about this. You even were in Paris at the time when they were clearing these camps, right?
Yeah, so I actually had the chance I was a field producer for a half-hour news documentary on the Paris Olympics and the preparations, and this was a big issue in terms of the city busing out encampments and moving people from squats, putting pressure on them to get on the buses. And the city officials, or at least certainly the Olympic officials, were saying adamantly that this was separate from the Olympic Games. This has no relation to the Games. They're not the municipal officials. But of course, as you say, Amin, if this process and these centers were set up just the year before the Olympics, maybe we can't quite say causation, but there is a strong correlation there. And that has meant a lot of activists who work on this issue saying that this is directly related to the Olympics. They want to beautify Paris for the foreign visitors who come, not to see the fact that Paris does have an issue with being unable to provide affordable housing to a lot of the people that come there.
I mean, it's interesting you guys say that, because just going back to what Emmanuel Macron said, that soundbite that we had played a while back, he talked about two things, amongst other things, and these really caught my eye, because he was talking about, quote, the renovation of entire neighborhoods, and he was also talking about inclusion of people with disabilities and gender equality. So the operative word there being inclusion, this doesn't seem very inclusive at first glance, but maybe, as you say, it's more complex than just looking at it at first glance.
Yeah, I mean, the intention of the government aside, there are a lot of people in Paris who want these people to disappear, the homeless, the migrants from the streets before the games come and the whole world is looking at their city, just for optical reasons. And if you can share my screen again, I have a map of where these centers are. The thing about France is that it is very, not unique, but it is a country where everything is in Paris, really. A lot of the jobs, a lot of the systems, it all goes through Paris. It's a very centralized country. So I know from reporting on migration in a lot of other European countries like Germany, it's already seen as like a nightmare situation for a newly arrived asylum seeker to end up anywhere but the capital city, because then everything is a lot slower. You don't have access to the economy that you do in a major city. And a lot of these centers are in like a small town outside of a small city like Rennes or Angers or something like that.
They're being bused pretty far.
Yeah, it's really far away. I mean, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Marseille, these are like fairly large cities. There's probably a lot of resources there, but then you have places around here and here and here where, I mean, they're like industrial areas. There's not many jobs for the locals already. And I can imagine a lot of asylum seekers don't see their future there anyway. They're just basically going to these temporary housing situations. They might get food and lodging paid for a while, but it's not a permanent solution. They're not going to be integrated in French society as fast as they probably could in a big city like Paris.
And my understanding is that after they get bused to a distant city, some of them end up returning to Paris. And it seems like potentially that the plan really is that they are not around during the period of the Olympic Games, but it matters a little less once the Games are over.
Right. Another drawback for a lot of people is the security.
Yes, Sonia talked about this a little bit. Yeah.
She's saying what a nuisance it is to locals that they have to go through all these checkpoints now. But just in terms of civil rights, the fact that they're setting up cameras, hundreds more than they already have. I mean, Paris is already a pretty surveilled city, but they're using basically experimental AI technology to scan people, to look for what they call suspicious behavior, which, you know, that's how does AI determine what suspicious behavior is? There's all these legal precedents for people doing normal things and then being arrested for it because some computer somewhere decided that their activity was suspicious.
Doesn't China use similar systems?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what a lot of people are questioning. It's like, okay, Paris sets itself apart from Beijing, saying we're spending a lot less money, we're doing it green, we're being inclusive. But we also need to protect these millions of people who are descending on the city. So we're actually going to take a page from a playbook, from China's playbook, and do it here with
and
AI
increase
surveillance.
policing.
Yeah. They said France announced that they already basically investigated 1 million people. So they're looking at 1 million cases and making sure that they're not security threats. These include like Russians. They just uncovered that there was a potential Russian spy who in Paris who was talking to his handler in Russia about disrupting the games somehow, and they arrested him. By going to his
So some
house,
of the threats
basically.
are certainly legitimate, but then in the process, you have to investigate 1 million people.
Yeah, and there's the chat is slowly coming to life. I just want to sort of bring in some comments and observations that people are making, beginning with this user whose username I cannot unfortunately pronounce because it appears to be in Japanese. I can't read Japanese, but this person is saying, as a Japanese, the Olympics is a nightmare. We see Olympic problems a lot. Tokyo was a host city last time. And the same user is also saying that he or she would like to see a cheap Olympic happen. But when I look at the reality, I think it's unrealistic. I think it's something that we wanted to discuss in the latter half of this conversation. Yeah. And then there is also another user, Isi, who is saying that he or she lives near the Olympia Center in Munich. I drive the subway line that was built several times a week and often go to the Olympia Park. The games were in 1972, long before I was born. And this is, I think, goes to the point of the legacy of the Olympic Games. And I think for Paris, the legacy would probably be the River Seine and the cleanup there. And Sushma Singh is calling the Olympics a cause of pollution. That's what the chat is saying at the moment.
Very
I don't know
interesting.
what you guys think of that.
I mean, it's that ambivalence anytime ahead of the games when this conversation happens. Every 2 years or every 4 years, however you want to define it, between the summer and winter games, there are a lot of question marks about cost and who it benefits, who the games are actually for. So, Amian, anything else that we should be looking out for or people should know about in terms of these particular games?
Well, I would just summarize it and say that the games are a catalyst for a lot of projects that people in like the societies want to do in the country that wins the bid, and these changes stay around afterwards. So we're not just talking about like, oh, what's Paris like this week? We're talking about what is kind of the future of Paris. This is a major moment for Paris, and they've cleaned up the Seine, so maybe hopefully that'll stick around, and people can swim in that for years to come, and it'll never get dirty again. That would be great. But also the surveillance, the arming of police. They have the largest deployment of security forces in Paris in its entire history. I wrote it down here somewhere.
Largest peacetime deployment.
Peacetime deployment, that's right. So it's tens of thousands of police officers, soldiers, and security guards, and they're not going to disappear right after the games. They're going to be reduced, but a lot of precedents get set when you have something like this. And Paris is already a pretty militarized city. I think it was the first place I ever saw like an assault rifle when I was a kid.
Wow.
Because the police have always been walking around with these machine guns. I think it's just probably getting worse now after something like this.
Got it. If you're just joining us, we are talking about the Paris Olympics, and the question is, why can't it just be fun? Let's bring in our guests. They are on standby. Thanks so much for joining us, Minky Warden and Stanis Ellsberg. Let's start with Minky. As a reminder, I had said Minky is with the Human Rights Watch, and she's the Director of Global Initiatives. Minky, thanks so much for joining us. It is morning in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do at the intersection of big sports events and human rights?
Sure. Thanks very much. I think the basic point is that these major sporting events shouldn't contribute to human rights abuses. And I think it's very interesting that the last part of the conversation was about who are the Olympics for? And the answer is the Olympics are for the athletes, they're for the public, and they're about humanity. These Olympics and Paralympics in Paris will be the first ever to take place under a framework of international human rights. And I think that's an important starting point. The IOC says these will be the most quote unquote gender equal games ever. That's another important starting point. That means that there will be equal numbers of men and women competing as athletes. But the closer you look, you see that there is a new Olympic so-called there's a so-called Olympic surveillance law that will be the most aggressive in Europe. You see migrants in particular targeted. You see hijabi women athletes who aren't able to compete at all in the host nation in France because of their religion. And you also see gaps in protection for athletes, including horrific sexual and other abuse of athletes, and no meaningful reporting systems to stop it.
Yeah, and Amin was just also saying earlier about the level of surveillance within and around the city of Paris, bringing in the police, bringing in the military, I believe, as reinforcement, the implementation of more surveillance video cameras, including AI and facial recognition technology. And it sounds like the law that you mentioned is related to that and allowing the French government to do this. And, of course, after the games are gone, then presumably the law stays.
Yeah, I mean, this is the most invasive mass surveillance technology that France is pioneering. And we've seen, and I know you've seen, for the Beijing Olympics in 2008 and again in 2022, all of the mass surveillance technologies, all of the police restrictions stayed afterwards. So that was really one of the most pernicious legacies of past Olympics.
Now, Stanis, I just want to bring you in now. You're with the Danish Institute for Sports Studies. Can you tell us about the work you do in relation to the Olympic Games?
Yeah, sorry to correct you, but I'm actually working at Play the Game, but it is also under, no, but you're right, it is under the Danish Institute for Sports Studies, but at Play the Game, we mostly look at the intersection between sport and politics and good governance issues. And at Play the Game, we actually try to promote democracy, transparency, and freedom of expression in sport. So for the last 10 years or so, I've been looking much at the Olympics and the politicization of the Olympics from the host nations. And you can say that what we have seen throughout the last couple of decades, we will also see starting, actually today, with the Olympics starting today, but especially on Friday with the opening ceremony.
Thank you very much. For the both of you, we've been talking about, Amin certainly was also explaining the cost of the Paris Games, bringing down the cost after we've seen these mega events with China and Russia, Sochi with the Winter Games, and then the Winter Games in Beijing, and then even before the first Beijing Games in 2008. And of course, as Angelina, I would say that I'm very excited about the Los Angeles Games coming in 2028. It seems like there has been an attempt, certainly I'm aware of the conversation that's been happening in the last decade about trying to move the Games away from that big money model, but also away from host cities where it could be controversial. Can you both talk a little bit about that process? Is this something that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, is doing deliberately? I know that their language is often couched in very diplomatic terms, but did they eventually feel the pressure from media criticism about hosting the Games in China and Russia, where, for example, gay athletes might not feel comfortable, where these authoritarian states are anti-gay, and so on and so forth? Let's go to Minky first.
So the bottom line is there has to be a human rights framework in place for choosing these major sporting events. And I think it's, we're actually seeing the trend line going the wrong way. Saudi Arabia is about to host the World Cup in 2034 and build 10 new stadiums in the desert with migrant laborers operating under a modern day slavery system called kafala. I think the IOC has the Olympics will be hosted next in Los Angeles, but every host, the United States, France, China, they all have profound human rights problems. And unless you have a human rights framework in place to address them, you're going to exacerbate whatever those problems are. So in Los Angeles, for example, as in Paris, there's a large community of people living without homes, of migrants and others who were vulnerable, who have been pushed out of their homes to make way for these games. And in fact, Olympics and the World Cup they should really lead to reforms for tolerance, non-discrimination, labor rights. And that's, I think, the trend line, certainly with Saudi Arabia hosting these events, is not necessarily going the right way. And I know Stanis has investigated this as well.
Stanis, over to you.
Yeah, so I think if we look a little bit back in history, you're right that we saw the Beijing Olympics in 2008. We saw the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014. And then there was starting to become this narrative that the current IOC president, Thomas Bach, was starting to give more democratic-minded nations the Olympics, starting with the Olympics here in Paris, and then we will go to Los Angeles in 28, and then in 32 we will go to Brisbane in Australia. So he was kind of the savior of the democratic values. But I have to remind people that this is the same president that yesterday convinced the IOC members that they should award the new established Olympic esports games to Saudi Arabia, starting with a 12-year collaboration with the National Olympic Committee of Saudi Arabia. And it's not just a sports Olympic committee in Saudi Arabia, it's the same people that sits on numerous ministerial boards, and of course, on top of it all, it's Mohammed bin Salman's work. And so the narrative of the IOC turning towards the democratic nations is at best a story that the IOC themselves want people to tell, and not least Thomas Bach.
Minky, can you explain to us the bidding process? I understand that it's changed a little bit. And is that change better? I don't know to what extent you understand how it's changing. We were trying to read about it. It was very confusing. And I'm wondering whether it's related to this human rights framework. And then, sorry to throw another question at you, but in regards to a human rights framework, it's not really enforceable, is it? Like, who can actually, it's a sort of in-spirit commitment, isn't it?
So the UN, the boring but important UN guiding principles on business and human rights say that you have to have a framework in place to address the inevitable problems that arise with events of this scale. And that includes, you must have human rights due diligence, and that should be part of the selection for any future host city. Are there laws that ban LGBT people from fully participating in society? Are there restrictions on women's rights, such as the male guardianship system in Saudi Arabia? It's not clear at all, for example, how the human rights framework was applied, as Stanis mentioned, in the awarding of the esports Olympics. But I think the framework is not binding or mandatory, but increasingly there are laws in Europe and other places to make it so. That means you can't, for example, have forced labor building your stadiums. You're not allowed to exclude women and girls simply because of their gender. So I think the framework is an important step forward, but it has definitely not been applied in the selection of host cities. Because if it was, that would be a transparent process that groups like Human Rights Watch would be taking part in. So we report on more than 100 countries worldwide. Those reports are available on the internet. And I think it's really, it's not clear at all what the process was to, for example, select the next Winter Olympics for Salt Lake City. The U.S. has a lot of profound human rights problems, and they need to be addressed as part of any bid.
My understanding is that the bidding process, even though it's changed, is they talk about transparency, but it's actually quite not very transparent. I don't know if you have any insight on that.
Yeah, it's completely opaque. And I think the changes came for two reasons. One, profound corruption in the past and purchasing of votes, which we've also seen for other major sporting events like the Qatar World Cup. And the other reason is that these events, that the countries that were raising their hands to host them were China, Russia, places where there is forced doping of athletes, where there is not guaranteed press freedom. So that is a problem for the International Olympic Committee and the Olympic movement. And athletes shouldn't have to compete in a place where they're not allowed to be their authentic selves, or where they have risks for speaking up about human rights abuses.
Yep.
Melissa, I think you'll remember that for the Beijing Winter Olympics, athletes later, spoke up and awarded their medals to political dissidents in China. But that's really a lot of pressure on athletes as they're trying to compete in the most important games of their lives.
Minky, it's a good point to make. Can I just ask you, Stanis, about that? I mean, based on what Minky is saying, there wouldn't be very many countries in the world that meet all those standards to be able to host a big event like the Olympics, to have those resources, to have the rights based along UN principles, to be able to implement them, to have a clean Olympics, so to speak. What does that mean for the Olympics? Should one not have them, or should one break it down into smaller events through the year? I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a new idea. It could be a great idea. I mean, there's plenty of rooms for new ideas for the Olympics because they have become so expensive. And as you say, that, of course, narrows down how many countries are willing to put all these kind of monies into hosting the Olympics. So there is room for improvement with the costs going down. But you have to remember that the IOC members and the president of the IOC, they want the biggest show in the world. And if there's countries that are willing to pay for them, well, then why should they change anything? When it comes to the Winter Olympics, it's a little bit more problematic. I don't think we will see any problems finding host for the Summer Olympics for the next 2-3 decades, because the Middle East countries are very willing to use their money for hosting the Olympics. And of course, China will be back at some point, and maybe someday Russia will be back into the good community of sport as well. But for the Winter Olympics,
I'm sorry
it's a
to
problem.
interrupt, but then don't they all fail on the human rights front? I mean, this is exactly what Minky was talking about.
Yeah, they absolutely fail, and Minky is very right. And the problem is that there's no independent organization looking at the human rights issues in these countries, and one of them could be Human Rights Watch. I don't see why the IOC don't reach out to Minky and her people to do the due diligence on the human rights issues, because the IOC hasn't done their work that well. As I said earlier, they just awarded Saudi Arabia the esports games for the next 12 years, and I don't expect them to have done any due diligence on the human rights issues.
You know, not just on the human rights. I want to bring one point in that was made in the in the community chat about the costing of these things. This is from user Steph Lemay, who is, I hope I pronounced this correctly, who is asking, can the world afford the Olympics with such poverty?
Yeah, who wants to take that one? I don't know.
I'll take it, but I also suggest going to Stanis because
For both,
he's a great expert. He's a great expert on what we call sports washing, which is deploying beloved sports or athletic events in the service of washing away profound human rights abuses. And I think, we all believe that sports provides opportunities for scholarships, education, good health. It contributes remarkably to human rights in the world. And I do want to say one positive thing about the refugee Olympic team. Because the refugee Olympic team has expanded every year since 2016. These are athletes from a dozen countries who were refugees and who are supported by the Olympic system to achieve their dreams and participate in the Olympics. That's a really important, and these are athletes from Afghanistan and other places where sport is banned entirely. So there's obviously a positive role for sport, including to uplift vulnerable communities, refugees, and others. But at the same time, these events don't have to be $200 billion. You can use the existing stadiums that you have. I think it's really important that when we talk about sustainability, that means you don't build a dozen new stadiums with forced migrant labor. That's the really worrying trend on the horizon. And as Stannis says, these are countries in the Gulf that don't have human rights, that have male guardianship systems that restrict the participation of women and girls, and they're using sports to cover this up.
Stannis, can you tell us a little bit more about sports washing?
Yeah, sure. So it's a term that we have heard a lot for the last couple of years, not least due to also the great work that Human Rights Watch has done, the Amnesty International, and all kind of other NGOs who has worked in sport and the connection with human rights, because it came to the knowledge of all of us when Azerbaijan hosted the European Games in 2015 and had their Formula One also in Baku. Then we really started to talk about sports washing. In the last couple of years, it was, of course, also very much related to Qatar, who used the World Cup in 2022 to cover up their human rights violations in the country. And now we see Saudi Arabia engage in world sport, also to use sports to cover up their human rights issues. But it's a much broader strategy from these countries, because they also use sports to get new kind of connections all around the world, diplomatic relations, entice tourism, get diplomatic relations all around the world. And they use sports for that, sponsorships for all kind of international federations, organizations, ownerships of clubs. So, and they have all the kind of money that they have to use on it.
But can I? Okay.
Yeah, just go ahead.
This on this question of sports washing and using the Olympics and big events to their benefit. When we talk about countries like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and China, for example, these are countries which wield significant influence. I mean, Saudi Arabia is big enough to be awarded American weapons. Yeah, it buys American weapons. Qatar has an important role to play diplomatically in the Middle East. We are seeing that right now with the current war that is on in the Middle East. So these countries can contribute when it comes to that. China can be the world's factory and the world is okay with it. But when it comes to hosting big events, our expectations, are they unfairly high? Or should we tone down our expectations based on what is doable?
Yeah, I'll take that one and then go to Stannis. But listen, all countries, every nation, all companies commit human rights abuses. And it's just a question of whether you have a framework to identify those human rights abuses and remedy them. So every country commits human rights abuses. Let's just say that. There's no country that doesn't. There's no nation that doesn't. And I think it's really important that you have that framework in place. So just to pick up on Stannis's point, things like the women's tennis finals is going to Saudi Arabia. But it's still the case that peaceful critics are jailed and the male guardianship system denies women and girls basic human rights. So looking broadly at the world of sport, the question is, all countries have the potential to host one of these major sporting events, but these events must only go to places that have a framework in place to address and fix very serious human rights abuses and problems that always occur in the planning and execution of these events.
I want to take a moment right now just to check in with Dustin, because we've been talking, first of all, to remind people, if they're just tuning in, that we are talking about the Paris Olympics and the Olympics as an institution after Paris. Why can't it just be about fun? And we're talking about pretty intense things such as human rights violations. But Dustin, what are people saying in chat? Any sense of how people are feeling and whether their opinions have changed based on what Minky and Stans have been saying?
Yeah, I think so. Chat's been full of comments and full of research. So thank you guys for sharing your research as well. I think it's great if your users collaborate in the chat. And we've seen a lot of comments about the costs of the Olympics. User Steffle has sent a bunch of posts with the cost of Sochi and the cost of the Rio de Janeiro Games. And we've already put the question from our users on, should these games be so expensive if parts of the world are living in poverty? And otherwise, I'm seeing a lot on human rights issues, but less questions, more comments. So Guys, if you have any questions, let me know via the chat, and we'll put them to our experts. And feel free to ask critical questions as well. You don't need to be nice to them. I'm sure experts can handle a critical question as well.
Yeah,
I just bring in one suggestion,
Yes.
and then maybe we can discuss that.
It's
It's a suggestion in the form of a question from Isi, who's saying, why not find one place where one holds the games always? Athens, maybe.
Or maybe like Antarctica, where there there is no
cold.
government, and then
And there is no
it's
chance of
neutral
human rights
territory.
abuses, yeah.
Because I guess my question is how you implement the human rights framework. It sounded from our conversation just now that it could either be a way of encouraging countries that have won the bid to make some corrections. They still get to host the Olympics, but then they have to make some pledges to improve somewhat. It could also mean that any country that the very Western-leaning Olympic executive board deems as not viable, that they just never, ever in the future are allowed to host the Olympics, which for me, so growing up, the Olympics was always this kind of dreamy version of world peace, where every 4 years the world puts down its disagreements and gets together, and we celebrate the fact that we're all humans and we can compete together. And I think there is something to that. When you see Chinese athletes and Russian athletes competing against American athletes, and they kind of high-five each other after a swim competition or something like that, it's heartwarming. It's a very 90s version of peace, but it's like, I think there is something to that, and I think that's why a lot of people do love the Olympics.
Yeah, it reminds us of our similarities as opposed to differences.
Right, and I think the version of not allowing Russia or China to participate, it doesn't mean that they're going to make changes in their societies so that they are allowed to join the Olympics. I don't think they would do that. What would happen is they just stop participating in the Olympics. And honestly, without Russia and China, what are the Olympics? I mean, the US wins medals, Russia and China wins medals, and then some European countries win medals. But it just wouldn't, it wouldn't be the same. So I'm just wondering, maybe we could also throw that question back. Does it mean that, okay, China from now until the time it becomes a democracy is banned from competing, or not competing, but hosting the Olympics? Or does it mean that they have to make some pledges in order to
there's certainly been issues. For example, for the Paris Games, I understand that the Russian athletes cannot compete under their flag.
Right.
And not all of them that ordinarily would be sent to the Games are participating. And that reminds me of something that Minky was saying about the Beijing Winter Olympics and how some athletes did want to dedicate their medals to human rights dissidents and yet didn't feel like they could say anything until they left the country. And so this is a question for both Minky and Stanis, which is, we've been talking a lot about the institutions. You touched upon the feelings of the athletes. Do we have a sense from the athletes from all over the world? Has there been any studies or research to get a sense of what they feel and whether there is some consensus among the diversity of athletes in terms of their thoughts on the politics of the Olympics? Over to you, Minky, first, and then Stanis next.
Yeah, so I don't think there's ever been such a study, but when athletes compete, they don't give up their basic human rights. And I think this is really important. Athletes actually also are workers. That's their job. So they should be working in environments which are free from sexual, physical, verbal abuse. They should have the right to be paid for the work that they do. And they should be able to participate. I want to remind people that millions of women and girls who are Muslim will compete in sports with a hijab, with a sport hijab, and that enables them to play. Yet France, the host nation, has aggressively banned its Muslim women citizens from playing sport in hijab. And that's actually excluded top players who've had to go to other countries, to like the United States or other places, to compete. So I think the goal is actually that the Olympics should bring positive change. And Melissa, you may remember for the 2008 Olympics, the IOC pressed the government very hard to change its press freedom laws, and the government did. So the question is, for these games, there have to be rules. They're human rights rules. They apply to all the hosts. And you don't have a system of exceptionalism for the worst human rights abusers, where they simply get away with gaming the system.
Yeah, Minky is reminding me of my time in Beijing during the Olympic Games as a reporter. I used to be based there, and she's absolutely right. There was legislation that did allow us to travel around the country without permission, which used to be required. So it was quite a golden age, relatively speaking, of reporting in China as a foreign correspondent. Stanis, do you have a sense through your research what athletes want or wish with this, or are a lot of them just focused on the competition and try to stay out of politics? Are they uncomfortable with being thrust into these conversations whenever they go to these global sporting events?
Well, I think most athletes just want to compete, but of course we see more and more athletes engage in societal matters and use their voice to raise them. I just want to address one question raised in the studio. What will the Olympics be without Russia or China, I think was the phrasing. And
Right.
I just want to make it very clear that I'm not speaking against any people from any country being able to participate in the Olympics. I think all people should be able to participate. What we are talking about is the way that state governments from Russia, China, all over the world are using the Olympics for political matters. And it will be no different in France. Don't mistake that. Of course, France and the government will also use these Olympics to state highly political messages, not least on Friday through the opening ceremony, which is the most important platform for the host nation to state national and political messages, and they would never invest all these kind of $1 billion in the Olympics if it was not for the political side of it. It's not just about sports.
So when a user, Nathan Hill, asks the question, aren't the Olympics just about nationalism? He or she is right.
I'm gonna
Absolutely
say no.
right.
I'm gonna say no to that. And just to pick up on a point that Stanis made, it's really important to remember that the people are not their government, and the Chinese people are not their government. The Russian people are not their government, and the athletes of these countries have sometimes been forced to dope. I mean, this has gone back for decades. This is, human rights abuses are committed by governments against their people, and that includes athletes. So it's really important not to say China as a government, but to say China as a people, or Russia as a people. And the same thing goes for Saudi Arabia as a people. So I think the fundamental problem here is that there is a human rights framework in place. It hasn't been adequately applied. And, France also is not adequately applying the human rights human rights framework for these Olympics, with things like the Olympics named surveillance law, with the banning of women and girls from playing sport and hijab at all levels in the country. So there are lots of things that every country could get better. This isn't a question about democracies or not. It's a question of, do you have systems in place to fix the problems? You definitely have.
Minky, can I just ask you, I mean, trying to implement this framework on human rights, the fact that countries, including countries like France, for example, are not implementing it in the way it perhaps should be, does that suggest that this framework is hard to implement in practice when it comes to such a massive event like the Olympics?
I think it's not hard. It's actually, in some cases, just political will. Right, the organizations implementing, for example, the ban on hijabi little girls playing basketball, that's the French Basketball Federation and the French Soccer Federation. And these international bodies, FIBA and FIFA, eliminated those bans as exclusion and discrimination back in 2014 and 2017. So it's really a question of these bodies, the IOC, these sports federations, implementing, there's literally no cost to saying little Muslim girls can play basketball in France. So there's zero cost there. It's just a question of political will.
Stanis, if there's one thing you wanted to see happen in terms of the IOC making some clear decision in the right way forward in terms of how you view things, what would you like to see?
Well, that would be a whole nother point that what we have discussed, but I would say, well, the Olympics is only there because of the athletes. So maybe we should start paying the athletes what they deserve, and it could be equally pay money for everyone. The Olympics generate billions of dollars on the Olympics, but the athletes don't get anything except participation. Maybe we should start giving them some money.
Well, I think that's about it. I don't want to hold Minky and Stanis up too much. We've talked to you for quite a long time, but before you guys get going, Minky starting out your day and Stanis you finishing up yours, I would love to just give you guys a chance for final thoughts. Stanis, first to you, and then we'll go to Minky.
Yeah, I would say that one of my research areas for the last decade has been the opening ceremony of the Olympics. It's maybe the most political staged television shows ever seen in the history of television. So be aware on Friday. Go to our website maybe and read about the political side of the opening ceremony. I will also have a look out for the opening ceremony on Friday in Paris.
Minky.
Yeah, I'd like to leave the viewers and listeners with one thought, and that is that athletes, and there are more than 10,500 who are competing in Paris for the Olympics alone, deserve protections in sport and a safe way to report. The Sport and Rights Alliance yesterday brought out a new report working with Indian Olympic wrestlers to document the failure of the Federation and the IOC to stop sexual abuse by the president of the Wrestling Federation of India. And I think all athletes deserve protection in the workplace. We just have to remember that the Olympics are a workplace like any other, and there need to be reporting systems. There needs to be a hotline to stop abuse. And the IOC is a wealthy organization. This isn't so much a question of money as it is a question of political will.
Minky Worden, thank you so much for joining us. Stanis Ellsberg, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Wow, that was really interesting. And of course, Stanis mentioning the opening ceremony reminds me that that is going to be quite controversial because I understand, going back to the beginning of our conversation earlier about security, this is going to be an unusual opening ceremony. It's going to be held not in an arena, but actually going to be held on the River Seine.
Right.
Did I pronounce that right? Seine?
Seine, right.
Okay.
Yeah. Usually it's in an indoor event, and
Yeah.
you have security, people pay tickets, and they wanted to bring it back to the people. That was their original intention, and make it not for the elites who can pay high prices for the tickets, but go outside, and basically anybody can show up and watch this world event take place, the Olympics, just floating down the Seine on a set of barges. So the teams, instead of walking around the stadium, they would just stand on a barge and do their little celebration. I don't really
Waving
know
of
what
the
they
flag,
did.
I
Yeah,
guess,
exactly.
yeah.
They wave the flag. I remember one year this guy was like all oiled up.
Yeah.
And everybody was going
Tonga.
crazy about that.
Can't
From
use it.
Tonga, yeah.
Yeah.
You remember that.
I'm sorry,
That
I
was your
admit, I
Olympic
completely
memory. That's your
remember.
Olympic memory.
I was trying to remember which one you know. Yeah.
But anyway, so
Oil guy.
this ironically was like 5-6 weeks after the interior minister said, after the big terror attack in Russia, that was claimed by the Islamic State.
Recently, yeah.
Recently, yeah, it was in March. Right after that, the interior minister said, we're expecting a similar attempt at the Olympics. He just said that point blank. So
Wow.
they're expecting a terror attack on the scale of this Russian attack that killed over 100 people.
Really?
At the same time, they're like, but we're going to do our parade outside. That obviously was not okay for a lot of people, and there was a high demand for more security. So they are now trying to come up with this way to like protect it. So you still have to get tickets to get to the river.
I think, Wade, in the control room, while we're talking about this, can you roll? I think we have visuals of this parade we're talking about, the opening ceremonies for this upcoming Paris Games on Friday. So anyways, yeah. Sorry, Amin. You were saying.
This is
I mean,
a
it looks
simulation,
epic.
though,
This
right?
hasn't happened yet. You haven't missed anything. Just in case people are
It's
wondering.
AI predicting the future.
Although the Olympics do get underway today, right? Today is like the first event.
Yeah,
There are
there's some
some
events even before the opening
competitions,
ceremony, which is pretty interesting.
The Olympics are underway, people, but the opening ceremony is on Friday.
That's right.
With a security problem where they're saying, oh, something could happen during the games.
Yeah, it's a strange messaging, to be honest, but I guess they're trying to show strength. They're trying to say we're aware that there's going to be there could be a terror plot, but we have some of the best security in the world, and we're going to prove that we can deal with that. And it's pretty brave to do it outside, I would say. And if it works out, it could be like a great publicity stunt, or a coup anyway, because it's, that would be enjoyable. I think 300,000 people could theoretically show up and watch along the banks of the Seine as on Friday the parade goes by. And I think Sonia was talking about, our reporter in Paris, was saying that it was really annoying for a lot of Parisians and this is right in the center of the city. Most people have to cross back and forth to get to their jobs. And it's going to be like the highest security in Europe.
I was just looking. That video said 600,000 participants.
Yeah, but they've reduced it to 300,000 because
due
of
to security.
Got
it.
But just as an idea, I think it's fantastic that they are not holding the opening ceremony in a stadium. Normally, it's always stadiums, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because that's the biggest piece of infrastructure you have to accommodate so many people and performers and athletes and everybody. But then to do this on a river like this in the middle of the city, I don't know if this has ever been done. I always think of opening ceremonies and associate them with stadiums when it comes to the Olympics.
Right.
Can we just talk about this clip for a second? I thought it was really...
let's play it again. Should we play it again?
Yeah, let's play it again. I thought it's really... it kind of switches from being very like, oh, this is a democratic, wonderful democracy moment where everyone comes together. And then when I watched the renderings of like the actual thing, I felt like it looks like actually an autocratic nightmare.
Yeah, Wade, could you play that again? Because we were talking about, play that opening ceremony video again. They're working on it. There we go. It's a security issue. So suddenly you can kind of understand why they want these surveillance cameras.
Yeah, of course.
If you're going to pull something like this off.
I mean it's a fair question, right? I mean, an event of such a size, how do you not put extra manpower on the streets? And if you're searching for extra manpower, where else other than the armed forces to provide that manpower, A? And B, when you're talking about a world where threats can come from cyberspace and they can very easily enter into the real world, you need technology to beat technology. And I suppose that is where artificial intelligence comes in. I mean, what is the alternative? How does one do it then?
Right.
If not using this?
Yeah.
Totally.
I found the number. It's 75,000 security personnel, including soldiers, police, and private security guards, who are going to be deployed in Paris over the next few weeks.
You have to saturate the ground with security people, right? I mean, I don't know what the...
Or you don't have to, right? That's what the human rights activists are saying. And that's what makes these games always very complicated, and why we ask that question, why can't it just be fun? Because there's all this stuff that we've talked about over the past hour. Dustin?
Yes.
You had a poll question in the beginning.
Yes, we do have a poll question.
And I wonder whether this conversation with Minky and Stanis has changed people's minds.
It did change them by, and that's the wonderful thing about the poll question, it did change them by exactly 10%.
Oh.
We can measure it.
Exactly. So yeah, a little bit, like about 10% less people say, yes, there should be Olympic Games, but it's still, most people still want that. So we have a clear yes from 41% of the people voting. And oh, by the way, the votes went up by about 120, so it's like almost 200 people now. So we have 41% saying, yes, definitely we should have Olympic Games. 15% are saying, yes, but keep the costs low. And then 19% are saying, no, but I love the Olympics. I just don't think I want them in my city. And then 25%, a quarter of them are saying, actually, I don't need Olympics at all. We don't need these games. So if you count this all together, no's and yeses, it's about 57% for yes and 44% for no. This might have just changed. I just see one of the percentages just changed before I did this math. So if I'm off by 1%, don't hold me to that.
And the question was specifically, do you want it in your city, right? So that's 51% said
yes, they
would be fine with it in their city.
Dustin, you said in the beginning you didn't want to tell people how you were going to vote in that poll if you could, because you didn't want to influence the vote. But now I'm curious, would you want the Olympic Games in your city?
Actually,
In Berlin,
so I
right?
voted differently. I voted as no, but I love the Olympics. But actually, I'm going to take that back because, you know, Stanis was saying how the opening ceremony is such a big deal. And then I was like, oh, I would love to see how Berlin does this. So now I'm going to change my answer to yes. I want to have it in Berlin just to see the opening ceremony.
Does this or doesn't do it?
Yeah, exactly. Does it work? Do people get there? Is the train too late? You know, these questions.
If this can fix the trains timetables in Germany, that would be something I'd sign up for.
You say that. We just had the Euros. We just had
Yes,
Euro 2024.
and it didn't...
That didn't do anything to affect train timetables. In fact, they became far worse.
Well, I mean, Amin and Viresh, I don't know if you want to answer that question or perhaps maybe end on a more positive note and share an Olympic memory that you guys...
Should I go first? Should we go from
Go.
there?
Yeah, you start.
So I don't really have any specific Olympic memory other than as a younger man than now, looking at the Barcelona Olympics 1992, and for some reason the pool competition, the diving competition, stays with me. I don't remember the names of any of the athletes, but I was just amazed by the size of the Olympic pool and these fit athletes diving with impeccable form into water. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the Barcelona Olympics were, for me, the main Olympics that ever registered in my brain because of that visual of people diving off, how high is that?
10 meters, right?
Is it 10 meters?
Yeah.
I don't know. Diving off of that dive platform into these giant pools of water. Dustin?
Oh, for me, it's a very behind-the-scenes TV thing. I know a TV reporter who went there to cover them, and he was telling me about how crazy it is to sit behind the scenes in one of those vans, and then you see like 5 events happening at the same time. Each event has like 10 cameras, and then he has to coordinate he was working for German television and had to coordinate what the German audience would see. And then if 2 events had a German person competing, he would need to calculate in his head how to move one, record one, and then play it after. And he said, like, you can only do this for 4 hours. After that, your brain is fried, and you just need to lean back and, have a drink.
A lot of simultaneous thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Like a lot of screens as well, and it's all happening in like a very hot metal box.
Which Olympics was this? Which Olympics?
Oh, I think it was also... I don't want to say the wrong thing. I think it was Brazil, but like I don't know.
I was on a swim team when I was 8 years old, and at one point an Olympic swimmer came and signed autographs for us, and I thought she was like larger than life, and I always remember that as like an Olympic athlete is superhuman, you know, and that always stuck with me, and I feel like that is kind of the nice thing about the Olympics is that it gives you this kind of global renown, and all of a sudden you become like you're crowned globally, and it's something that everybody recognizes as legitimate. If you're an athlete, then if you won a gold medal at the Olympics, then you're the best of the best, you know. So I like these kind of like giant things in an age of like everybody's isolated and they're in their own niche online or whatever. And then the Olympics happen, and kind of everybody gets out of their little bubble and participates in something just by watching. Most people that's truly global, and that's kind of that's where my comments were coming from earlier, where I like things that are truly global, and I'm just a little bit defensive when I'm like, no, I don't want it to go away. And I think a lot of the fear about human rights and everything is completely legitimate, and I would be happy if that could actually make human rights improvements in countries, but I would be afraid that in this kind of like multipolar world that they would just be like, screw the Olympics, we're going to come up with our own games, and then all of a sudden you wouldn't have that anymore, and the world wouldn't be global anymore.
Yeah, I mean,
There'd be no fun.
There'd be no fun. Why can't it just be fun?
Why can't it just be fun? I mean, certainly my association with the Olympics is actually really positive. The first one I remember was the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games. I was super young. I was 4 years old. We had just moved to the United States as new immigrants. I didn't even quite fully understand the difference between where I came from and the fact that I was in a new country. But my first image, I didn't even know what the American flag was, that it was, a flag that was represented another country. And you had the 84 Games in Los Angeles, and my dad bought a little Olympics mug with a mascot, Sam, the American Eagle, with his little stars and stripes. So that that was my memory. That was essentially my introduction to the United States. So a very positive memory, and that's why, again, same thing. Everything that has been talked about in terms of human rights, I totally get, and yet I can't help emotionally feel excited about the fact that the Games are coming back to Los Angeles in 2028. And so you feel this conflict.
Yeah.
And was the Los Angeles Games the ones in which Russian athletes were banned from competing in?
That was 1980. No, that 1980 was in Moscow, and I think 84. I'm not sure. That one is way too young to remember.
Because the U.S. boycotted the one in Moscow, right?
In 80.
And weren't Russian athletes also banned in 84? Maybe I've got it all mixed up.
We're getting mixed up.
Maybe I'm just wrong. It tells you my age as well.
Somebody Google it.
Somebody Google it. With that, thank you so much for joining us for this week's News Desk. It's been a great chat. We hope you thought so too. And thanks to those of you who took part and shared some of your memories early on.
Thanks so much for joining us. And don't forget, next week we're back again at the same time for another News Desk. You can tune in to the DW News YouTube community page on Tuesday to find out what the subject, the theme is going to be. And then we will have the live stream on Wednesday.
Goodbye.
We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.